My Aunt Patty has lived in that house in Wise County for going on 38 years. She moved there with my Uncle Frank in 1986, the year they got married, into a farmhouse that Frank's grandfather had built by hand during the Depression. Frank died of a stroke in 2011, fast and sudden on a Saturday morning while he was fixing the porch railing, and Patty stayed on alone because the house was paid for, and the hollow was the only place she'd ever felt like herself. She was 71 when her hip gave out in the winter of 2023, a fall on the icy back steps that put her in the hospital in Norton for a week before they transferred her to a rehab facility in Kingsport where her daughter, my cousin Michelle, could be closer to help. The house couldn't sit empty for 6 to 8 weeks in January. Pipes would freeze. The wood stove needed feeding. The 2 outdoor cats needed someone to fill their bowls and make sure the coyotes that ran the ridge above the property didn't get bold enough to come down into the yard. Patty asked if anyone in the family could stay there while she recovered. I said I would. I was between apartments in Bristol, sleeping on a friend's couch, and the idea of having a whole house to myself for a couple of months sounded like a gift. That's what I thought it was, a gift. The house sat at the head of a holler in the southwestern corner of Wise County, about 8 miles from the nearest town, and a half-mile walk through overgrown pasture from the nearest neighbor, a man in his 80s named Clyde who raised goats and didn't own a telephone. The road in was gravel over packed dirt, narrow enough that you had to pull off into the weeds if another vehicle came the other way, which almost never happened because the road served exactly 2 properties, Patty's and Clyde's, and Clyde didn't get visitors. The house itself was a 2-story frame structure, white clapboard over hand-hewn timber, with a stone foundation and a metal roof that Frank had put on in the early 90s. The first floor had a kitchen, a living room, a bathroom, and a small bedroom off the back that Patty used as a sewing room. The second floor had 2 bedrooms and a storage closet. And above the second floor, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway, was the attic. I moved in on a Tuesday, brought a bag of clothes, some groceries, my laptop, and a portable speaker for music. The house was cold when I arrived, the wood stove having gone out sometime after Patty's fall, and it took me most of the afternoon to get it going again and bring the temperature up to something livable. I chose the upstairs bedroom on the right, the one that had been Frank and Patty's, because it had the better mattress and a window that looked out over the holler toward the ridge. I unpacked, made the bed with quilts from the closet, and settled in. By evening, the house was warm and the cats had been fed, and I was sitting at the kitchen table eating canned soup and feeling, for the first time in weeks, something like peace. The first 3 nights were uneventful. I'd wake up, feed the stove, feed the cats, and spend the day reading or walking the property or doing small maintenance tasks Patty had asked me to handle. The house was quiet in the way that old farmhouses in deep hollows are quiet, not silent, because the structure itself made constant noise, creaking and popping and settling, the thermal language of old wood responding to temperature changes, but quiet in the human sense. No voices, no traffic, no music or television from a neighboring house. Just the wind and the wood and the distant sound of water running through the creek at the bottom of the property. On the 4th night, I woke up at 2 in the morning. I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep at first. I lay there in the dark, in the big bed under the quilts, and I listened. The house was doing its usual thing, the ticking and creaking that I'd already learned to tune out. And then I heard it. Above me, on the other side of the ceiling, in the attic directly overhead, a scratching sound, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails across the underside of the attic floorboards, not the quick, skittering scrape of an animal's claws. This was measured, controlled, a long, slow drag that lasted maybe 3 seconds, followed by silence, then another drag in the same direction. I lay there and I told myself what you tell yourself. Raccoons, squirrels, mice, animals get into attics all the time, especially in winter when they're looking for warmth. The sound was probably a raccoon shifting across the floorboards, its claws catching on the grain of the old wood. I rolled over and pulled the quilt higher and closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. The scratching continued for another 20 minutes. The same slow, deliberate rhythm, and then it stopped. I drifted off sometime after 3. The next night it was back. Same time, roughly, same sound, but something was different. I'd moved downstairs after dinner to read in the living room, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch. The scratching woke me, and it was directly above me. Not above the bedroom where it had been the night before. Above the living room, above whatever room I happened to be in. I lay on the couch and listened, and felt the first real thread of unease weave itself into my chest. I got up and walked to the kitchen. I stood there in the dark and listened. Silence above. I walked back to the living room. Within 30 seconds, the scratching started again, directly over my head. I walked to the sewing room. Silence. Back to the living room. Scratching. I did this 3 more times, moving between rooms and waiting, and every time I settled in one spot, the scratching found me. It tracked my position through the house with a precision that made the animal explanation impossible. No raccoon follows a person from room to room through an attic, matching their movements with a delay of less than half a minute. What Stremp there knew where I was, and it wanted to be directly above me. I didn't sleep well that night. I stayed in the upstairs bedroom with the door locked, which was irrational since the attic was above me regardless, but the locked door gave me a false sense of security that I needed. The scratching came and went in intervals, sometimes stopping for 10 or 15 minutes before resuming, always directly overhead, always with that same slow, dragging rhythm. By the 5th night, the scratching had changed. It had developed a pattern. 3 long drags, each lasting about 2 seconds, then a pause of maybe 5 seconds, then 2 short taps. Sharp, precise taps, like knuckles rapping on wood from the wrong side. 3 drags, pause, 2 taps. 3 drags, pause, 2 taps. It repeated this sequence over and over with a consistency that eliminated any remaining possibility of animal behavior. Animals don't create rhythmic patterns. Animals don't tap. Whatever was producing this sound was doing it with intention, with awareness, with the kind of deliberate repetition that communicates something, even if the message is incomprehensible. I lay in bed and listened to that pattern for 3 hours. 3 drags, pause, 2 taps. The sound was directly above the bed, never wavering from that position, fixed on me the way a spotlight fixes on a performer. I tried to decode it. 3 and 2, 3 and 2, a count, a signal, a code. I thought about Morse code, but I didn't know Morse code, and the pattern didn't seem to have the variation that Morse requires. It was simpler than that, more primal. Like someone trying to communicate with the most basic tools available, the kind of signal you'd make if you were trapped somewhere, and the only thing you could do was scratch and tap and hope that someone below you understood. On the 6th morning, I decided I'd had enough of lying in bed theorizing. I was going into the attic. The pull-down ladder was in the upstairs hallway, a wooden contraption with springs that squealed when you released the catch and unfolded it downward. I'd seen it every day, but hadn't had a reason to go up. Patty hadn't mentioned anything about the attic needing attention, and the hatch had been closed flush against the ceiling since I arrived. I pulled the ladder down around 10 in the morning, broad daylight, sun coming through the hallway window. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and climbed up. The attic was a single open space that ran the length of the house, with the roof rafters forming an A-frame overhead and the floor made of wide plank boards laid across the joists. It was cold up there, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled like dust and old wood and something faintly chemical, like mothballs or preservative. The space was cluttered with the accumulated storage of decades, furniture covered in sheets, stacks of cardboard boxes marked in faded marker with labels like Christmas and Frank's Things and Kitchen Extra, old suitcases, a dressmaker's mannequin that made my heart lurch when the flashlight hit it. Everything was coated in a thick layer of gray dust that told me no one had been up here in years. I swept the flashlight across the entire space, empty of anything living. No raccoon, no squirrel, no nests, no droppings, no sign of animal habitation at all. I walked the length of the attic slowly, stepping on the joists to avoid putting my weight on the floorboards, and I checked every corner and every shadow. Nothing. The attic was exactly what it appeared to be. A storage space in an old farmhouse, undisturbed and lifeless. I was about to climb back down when I noticed something in the far corner, the corner that corresponded roughly to the position above the head of the bed where I'd been sleeping. The flashlight caught a small pile of material on the floorboards near where the roof slope met the floor. I crouched down and looked. Wood shavings. A handful of pale, curled shavings. The kind you'd produce if you were carving or boring into a plank with a sharp tool. They were fresh, clean-edged, not dried out, not gray with age like everything else in the attic. They'd been produced recently, days maybe, a week at most. I brushed the shavings aside and looked at the floorboard beneath them, and my stomach went cold in a way that started at the center and radiated outward until my fingers tingled. There was a hole. Not a natural hole, not a knot or a crack in the wood. It was carved, roughly circular, about the diameter of a quarter, with edges that showed the marks of a blade, a knife, or a chisel, worked into the wood from above. The hole went almost all the way through the floorboard. I could see the pale, unweathered wood at the bottom of the bore, and beyond it, just barely visible through the thinnest remaining layer of plank, the white surface of the bedroom ceiling below. Whoever had carved this hole had stopped about a quarter of an inch from breaking through. A quarter of an inch, the width of 2 or 3 sheets of cardboard, the difference between the attic and the bedroom, between above and below, between watching and being watched. I pressed my eye to the hole, and I could see through. Not clearly, but enough. The bedroom below was visible in a distorted circle. The bed, the quilts, the nightstand, the pillow where my head had been resting every night while the scratching happened above me. Whoever had carved this hole had been carving it from directly above my sleeping position with a precision that meant they knew exactly where I was, exactly where my face was, exactly what angle they needed to look straight down at me while I slept. The shavings were fresh, the carving was recent, but the attic showed no sign of entry or habitation, no footprints in the dust, no animal tracks, no handprints on the boxes or the sheets. Just the shavings and the hole and the terrible, impossible fact that something had been up here, working patiently and deliberately, night after night, carving a window into the floor above my bed, and had left no trace of itself except the evidence of its labor. I climbed down the ladder. I folded it back up into the ceiling. I went to the bedroom and looked up at the spot above the bed where the hole was. The ceiling was smooth and unbroken. The plaster showed nothing. From below, you'd never know it was there. But it was there. A quarter inch of wood between me and whatever had been crouching in the dark above me, scratching and tapping and carving. 3 drags and 2 taps, working through the floor with the patience of something that had no deadline and no fear of being discovered. I packed my bag in 10 minutes. I called my cousin Michelle and told her I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I didn't explain why. I said something about a work opportunity in Bristol, and she said she'd find someone else, and that was that. I drove out of the holler, and I didn't look back, and I didn't slow down until I was on the highway with the mountains behind me, and the radio turned up loud enough to drown out the memory of that sound. Patty went home 2 months later. Michelle stayed with her for the first couple of weeks, and as far as I know, the house was fine. Nobody mentioned scratching. Nobody found anything in the attic. I never told Patty what I'd found because she was 71 years old and recovering from surgery, and that house was her home, and I wasn't going to poison it with something I couldn't explain. But I think about that hole. I think about it more than I should. I think about the quarter inch of wood that was left. Not the part that had been carved away, but the part that remained. The decision to stop. Because whoever or whatever was up there hadn't broken through. It had carved for nights, patiently, deliberately, producing those rhythmic scratches and taps that I'd listened to from below, and it had stopped just short of completion. Not because it couldn't finish. A quarter inch of old pine would take minutes to breach. It stopped because it wasn't ready, or because the timing wasn't right, or because there was something about the anticipation, the almost there, the nearly finished, that was part of the point. The hole wasn't the goal. The carving was the goal. The sound was the goal. Letting me lie there in the dark and listen, and wonder, and never quite understand what was happening 6 feet above my face. And I think about what happens next. Because Patty is in that house alone now. She sleeps in that bed, in that room, under that ceiling. And the hole is still there, a quarter inch from completion, waiting for whatever made it to come back and finish what it started. One more night. That's all it would need. One more night of scratching and carving and tapping in the dark above a sleeping woman who can't climb a ladder and can't run and can't do anything, except lie there and listen to the sound of something coming through the ceiling. And I wonder, on the nights when I can't sleep, and the house in Bristol is too quiet and my mind goes where I don't want it to go, whether I should have said something, whether I should have told her, whether the silence I chose to protect her with is the same silence that will be above her when the last quarter-inch gives way and the hole opens up and whatever has been waiting in that attic finally looks down and sees her face. My sister Karen is 4 years older than me and has always been the responsible one. She married a man named Travis, who works for the railroad, bought a house in Mercer County outside of Princeton when their first kid was born, and settled into the kind of steady, predictable life that I've never been able to manage for myself. 2 kids, a dog, a mortgage, the whole architecture of adulthood that some people build naturally and others, like me, keep circling around without ever finding the door. I don't say that with bitterness. Karen earned what she has. And when she asked me to house sit for a week in February of 2023 while she and Travis took the kids to visit his parents in Columbus, I said yes without hesitation. Partly because I wanted to help. Partly because my apartment in Bluefield had a heating problem that the landlord wasn't fixing, and the idea of a warm house with a full kitchen and a television that got more than 4 channels sounded like a vacation. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch on a quiet street about 2 miles outside of Princeton. It was built in the early 70s, brick exterior, carport on one side, a backyard that sloped down toward a tree line where the neighborhood ended, and a stretch of wooded hillside began. Karen and Travis had bought it 5 years earlier from an older couple who'd relocated to Florida, and they'd done a good job fixing it up. New floors in the kitchen, fresh paint throughout, updated bathrooms. The kids' rooms were bright and cheerful, the master bedroom was clean and simple, and the whole place had the lived-in warmth of a house where people were happy. Karen walked me through everything before they left. The dog's feeding schedule, the thermostat settings, the trick to getting the garbage disposal to work, where the extra blankets were if it got cold at night. And then, almost as an afterthought, she pointed to the baby monitor on the kitchen counter. It was one of those older audio-only models, a white receiver unit about the size of a walkie-talkie with a small speaker and a green LED that lit up when it detected sound. The transmitter, the other half of the pair, was plugged into the wall in the nursery, the small bedroom at the back of the house where their youngest, Ellie, slept. Ellie was staying with Travis's parents for the trip, so the nursery was empty, but Karen said she kept the monitor on because the plumbing in that part of the house was old, and she liked to listen for the sound of leaking water when the temperature dropped. It was easier than crawling under the house to check the pipes. I nodded and didn't think about it again. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I fed the dog, watched television, slept in the guest room, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of a house that was warm and quiet and not mine. The dog, a lab mix named Chester, was easy company, content to lie on his bed in the living room and accept the occasional scratch behind the ears without demanding much else. The house settled at night the way all houses do. The click of the heating system cycling on and off, the faint ticking of the water heater, the occasional creak from the roof when the wind gusted. Normal sounds. The sounds of a well-maintained house, doing what houses do. On the 3rd night, I was in the kitchen around midnight, making a sandwich and half watching a late-night show on the small television. Karen kept on the counter when the baby monitor crackled. I glanced at it. The green LED was lit, pulsing slightly the way it did when it picked up sound from the transmitter in the nursery. The speaker produced a soft hiss of static that rose and fell for a few seconds and then clarified into something else, breathing. Not the ambient hiss of an open microphone picking up room tone. This was breath. Slow, deep, wet at the edges. The kind of breathing you hear from someone standing very close to a microphone, close enough that you can hear the moisture in their throat and the soft click of their mouth opening and closing between inhales. It had a rhythm to it that was unmistakably human. In for 3 or 4 seconds, out for 3 or 4 seconds. Steady and patient, and unhurried. I set the sandwich down and picked up the monitor. The LED was solid green now, indicating continuous sound detection. The breathing filled the small speaker with a clarity that made it feel intimate, close, as if whoever was producing the sound was standing right beside me rather than in a room at the other end of the house. I held the monitor to my ear and listened. The breathing didn't change, didn't speed up, didn't respond to the fact that the receiver was being held by a person who was now fully alert and listening with focused attention. It just continued. In, out, in, out. The wet, heavy breathing of something that wasn't in a hurry. I put the monitor down and walked to the nursery. The hallway was dark and I turned on lights as I went, flipping every switch I passed. The nursery door was open, the way I'd left it. I stepped inside and turned on the overhead light. The room was empty. The crib was bare, the mattress covered in a fitted sheet with little yellow ducks on it. The window was locked, the curtain drawn. The closet door was open, and the closet was empty, except for a stack of folded blankets on the shelf. The transmitter unit was plugged into the wall outlet near the baseboard, its small red power light glowing steadily. But I could hear the breathing, not from the monitor, in the room. It was louder here, more present, filling the space with a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood in the center of the nursery and turned slowly, trying to localize the sound. It wasn't coming from the closet. It wasn't coming from the window. It wasn't coming from the ceiling or the floor. It was coming from the walls. From inside the walls, from the space between the drywall and the exterior brick, that hollow cavity where insulation and wiring and plumbing lived. The breathing resonated in that space, the way sound resonates in a drum, amplified and diffused until it seemed to emanate from the entire surface of the room at once. I put my hand flat against the wall beside the window. I could feel it, a faint vibration, barely perceptible, pulsing in time with the breathing. The wall was warm where I touched it, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the adjacent wall in the hallway, as if the air inside the wall cavity was heated by something organic. I pulled my hand away and stepped back. Chester was standing in the hallway outside the nursery door. He hadn't followed me in. He was just standing there, looking at me, his ears flat against his head and his tail tucked low, not growling, not barking, just watching me with an expression that I would have called concerned if dogs could be concerned. He wouldn't cross the threshold. I called his name and he took a step back rather than forward. I walked out of the nursery and closed the door behind me. Back in the kitchen, the monitor was still broadcasting. The breathing continued, steady and unchanged, as if closing the door had no effect on it, as if the sound existed independently of the room and the walls and the monitor, and was simply using all of them as channels through which to make itself heard. I did the only practical thing I could think of. I went back to the nursery and unplugged the transmitter unit from the wall. The red light went off. The unit was dead. No power, no signal. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the monitor. The green LED was still on. The breathing was still coming through the speaker. The same rhythm, the same wet, patient inhalation and exhalation. The transmitter was unplugged, and the receiver was still producing sound from a source that no longer existed in any electrical sense. I picked the monitor up and held it, and listened to something breathe through a device that shouldn't have been receiving anything at all. It went on for 45 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table with the monitor in front of me, and I listened because I didn't know what else to do. The breathing never changed, never accelerated, never responded to the sounds I made. The chair scraping, the refrigerator humming, Chester's nails clicking on the kitchen floor as he paced back and forth in the living room, refusing to come closer. It was self-contained, autonomous, a sound that existed in that house the way the heating system existed, built into the infrastructure, running on its own schedule regardless of who was listening. At 12:47, the breathing stopped. The LED went dark. The monitor fell silent and stayed silent for the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen until 3 in the morning, waiting for it to resume. It didn't. And eventually, I went to the guest room and lay on the bed with the light on, and Chester pressed against my legs, and I didn't sleep until the sun came up. I didn't plug the transmitter back in. I left it on the nursery floor where I'd set it after unplugging it, and I closed the nursery door, and I didn't open it again for the rest of the week. The monitor stayed silent on the kitchen counter. Chester stayed out of the hallway near the nursery, and I stayed in the guest room with every light on and the television playing at a volume that filled the house with human voices that belonged to the living. When Karen and Travis came home, I helped them unload the car and played with the kids and ate dinner with the family and waited until the children were in bed before I told Karen what had happened. I kept it simple. The monitor picked up breathing. The nursery was empty. The transmitter was unplugged, and the sound continued. Karen's face didn't do what I expected. She didn't look confused. She didn't look skeptical. She looked at the kitchen counter where the monitor sat, and her expression settled into something I can only describe as resignation. The quiet, tired acceptance of someone hearing confirmation of something they already knew. She told me the previous owners had a son, a boy who died in that room. She didn't say how. She didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. She said the monitor had picked up sounds before. Not every night, not on a schedule, but sometimes, usually in the winter, usually after midnight, the monitor would activate and produce sounds from the nursery that didn't have a source. Breathing. Sometimes what sounded like a small voice, not words, just the tonal quality of a child making sounds in the dark. She said she'd learned not to listen after midnight. She said she just turned the monitor off before bed and dealt with the plumbing checks in the morning. She said it the way you say things you've practiced, calmly and clearly, with the edges smoothed down from repetition. I asked her why she hadn't told me before I stayed there. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, because if I told you, you wouldn't have stayed. And she was right. I wouldn't have. And the thing that keeps me awake some nights isn't the breathing itself, though that was bad enough. It's the fact that my sister, my responsible, steady, sensible sister, puts her 2-year-old daughter to sleep every night in a room where something breathes in the walls after midnight. And she deals with it the way mountain people deal with everything that can't be fixed or explained. She closes the door, she turns off the monitor, and she doesn't listen. Because listening means acknowledging. And acknowledging means the room where her daughter sleeps isn't just a nursery. It's a place where the walls remember a child who was there before. And whatever is left of that child hasn't figured out how to stop breathing yet. The transfer came through in October of 2022. I'd been working equipment maintenance for a coal company out of Logan for about 3 years when they offered me a position at a mine site south of Pineville in Wyoming County. Better pay, better hours. A site manager who had a reputation for running a clean operation. The catch was the commute. Logan to Pineville was over an hour each way on mountain roads, and the shift schedule meant I'd be making that drive in the dark both directions for half the year. So I started looking for a rental closer to the site. The house I found was on a dead-end road about 6 miles outside of Pineville, a small 3-bedroom bungalow built sometime in the 60s, with vinyl siding and a metal roof, and a chain-link fence around a yard that backed up to state forest. The road served maybe 4 other houses, all of them spaced far enough apart that you couldn't see your neighbors unless you walked to the end of the driveway and looked. Beyond the fence, the forest started immediately, a dense mix of oak and hickory and poplar that climbed the hillside behind the house and extended for miles into publicly owned woodland where nobody lived and nobody went except the occasional hunter in deer season. The landlord was a man named Prater. He lived in Mullins and managed a handful of rental properties across the county. He was maybe 60, thin and weathered, with the quiet, careful demeanor of a man who had spent his life in these mountains and had learned that most things didn't need to be said out loud. He met me at the house to hand over the keys and walk me through the basics. Water heater, breaker panel, thermostat. He showed me where the propane tank was and how to read the gauge and told me to call him if anything major broke. He was efficient and polite and didn't waste words. But when he handed me the keys at the front door, he paused. He looked at me with an expression that I interpreted at the time as concern, but that I've since reconsidered as something closer to obligation. Lock the doors before dark, he said. Every door, every night. I nodded. I assumed he was talking about the usual rural concerns, break-ins, animals, the kind of opportunistic trouble that finds empty-looking houses on dead-end roads. He held my eyes for a beat longer than felt natural, and then he wished me well and drove away. I moved in that weekend. The house was clean and functional, and unremarkable in every way. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a gas stove, a living room with a window that looked out at the yard and the fence and the tree line beyond. I set up in the largest bedroom, unpacked my things, and settled into the routine of a new place. Wake up, drive to the site, work the shift, drive home, eat, sleep. The house was quiet, and the road was quiet, and the forest behind the property was quiet in the way that forests are quiet when they're big enough to absorb every sound that enters them. I locked the doors every night, not because of Prater's warning specifically, but because I'd always been in the habit. Front door, back door, side door off the kitchen, deadbolt and knob lock on each. I'd do a circuit before bed, testing each one and then turn off the lights and go to sleep. On the third morning, I woke up and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The back door was unlocked. The deadbolt was in the open position, and the knob turned freely. I stood there looking at it and felt that particular confusion that comes when your memory conflicts with physical evidence. I'd locked it. I remembered locking it. I remembered the feel of the deadbolt turning under my thumb and the click it made when it seated. But the door was unlocked and there was no getting around that. I told myself I'd been tired, that I'd thought I'd locked it but hadn't fully engaged the bolt, that the mechanism was old and maybe the throw didn't catch properly unless you applied extra pressure. That night I locked it deliberately. I stood at the back door and turned the deadbolt slowly, watching it extend into the strike plate, and then I tested the knob to make sure it was secure. I did the same for the front and side doors. I went to bed certain. In the morning, the back door was unlocked again. Deadbolt retracted, knob turning freely. Same as before. I checked the other doors. Locked. Only the back door had been opened. I went outside and looked at the back porch and the yard. Nothing. No footprints in the frost that had settled on the grass overnight. No signs of disturbance. The gate in the chain-link fence was still latched. The tree line stood silent and indifferent, 50 feet beyond the fence. Over the next week, I developed a system. I'd lock every door, then photograph each deadbolt with my phone to confirm the position. In the morning, I'd check. The back door was unlocked every single time. After the 5th night, the side door started unlocking too. After the 7th, the front, all 3 doors, every morning, deadbolts retracted, knobs turning freely, the house standing open to the outside while I slept. I installed a chain lock on the back door, the kind that you engage from the inside, a simple brass chain on a slide that can only be operated by someone standing in the kitchen. I put it on myself, drilled the screws into the frame, tested it a dozen times. That night I locked the deadbolt, locked the knob, and slid the chain into its slot. I stood there and looked at it, 3 layers of security on a single door. Whatever was happening, whether it was a faulty mechanism or my own sleep-addled confusion or something else entirely, the chain would tell me the truth. You can't open a chain lock from the outside. It's physically impossible without cutting the chain. In the morning, the chain was hanging loose. The slide was open, the chain dangling against the door frame, and the deadbolt and knob lock were both in the unlocked position. 3 locks defeated in a single night by something that either had access to the inside of my house or could manipulate hardware from the other side of a closed door. I stood in the kitchen in my underwear and bare feet, and I looked at that chain hanging there, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the situation. This was not a faulty lock. This was not a mistake. Something was opening my doors at night, and it was doing it from inside. I bought a camera the next day. A simple trail camera, the kind hunters use, with a motion sensor and infrared night vision. I mounted it on the kitchen counter, pointed at the back door, and set it to record continuously from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. I locked every door, engaged the chain, and went to bed. In the morning, the back door was unlocked. The chain was open. I pulled the camera's memory card and took it to work and loaded the footage onto my laptop during lunch. The recording was 8 hours of mostly nothing. The kitchen in green-tinted infrared, the back door visible in the center of the frame, the chain visible as a thin line across the gap between the door and the frame. For hours, nothing moved. The timestamp ticked forward in the corner. At 3:14 in the morning, the deadbolt turned. I watched it happen in the footage with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The thumb turn on the inside of the deadbolt rotated slowly and smoothly from the locked position to the unlocked position, as if an invisible hand was gripping it and turning it with deliberate care. There was no vibration, no sudden movement, just a slow, controlled rotation that took about 3 seconds to complete. Then the knob lock clicked. Then the chain slid out of its track, the brass fitting moving along the rail with the same unhurried precision, as if guided by fingers that knew exactly how the mechanism worked. The whole sequence took maybe 15 seconds. 3 locks, opened in order, from inside, by nothing visible. I watched it 3 times. On the 4th viewing, I noticed something I'd missed. The camera's field of view included not just the door, but the window beside it, which looked out onto the back porch and the yard beyond. In the seconds after the deadbolt began to turn, While the locks were being opened one by one, something appeared at the tree line. It was in the background of the frame, at the very edge of the infrared's range, but it was there, a shape, tall and still, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light's range, in the gap between two trees where the forest was darkest. It was roughly human in proportion, but I couldn't make out details. No face, no clothing, just a dark form, upright and motionless, oriented toward the house. It was waiting. That's what the footage showed me. Whatever was standing at the tree line wasn't approaching the house. It wasn't moving. It was standing there in the dark, facing the back door, waiting for the locks to open, as if it knew they would, as if the locks opening was the signal, the invitation, the last barrier being removed before it could cross the yard and the porch and the threshold and come inside. The last frame of useful footage, the frame just before the door began to swing inward under its own weight, showed the shape at the tree line in slightly more detail. The infrared had caught it at a marginally better angle, and I could see that it was thin, very thin, with arms that hung slightly forward of its body, and a head that was tilted at an angle that suggested it was looking not at the door, but at the window, at the camera, at me, in the future, watching the footage. I moved out the next day. Didn't finish the month. Didn't ask for my deposit back. I loaded my truck while it was still daylight, and I drove to a motel in Pineville and stayed there for 2 weeks until I found another rental on the other side of town. A duplex on a street with neighbors and streetlights and the comforting proximity of other human beings. I called Prater to tell him I was leaving. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I'd been locking the doors. I said I had. He asked if they'd stayed locked. I said they hadn't. He was quiet again. Then he said I should have told you more. I asked him what he meant. He said the family that lived there before me lasted about 2 months. The family before that, about 3 weeks. He said everyone reported the same thing. The doors, the locks, the feeling of something wanting in. He said he'd changed the locks 4 times and it didn't make a difference. And then he said something that landed in my chest like a stone and has stayed there ever since. He said the last family that stayed a full winter told him the doors didn't just unlock, they opened. And in the morning there were footprints in the house. Bare feet, too large and too narrow to belong to anyone in the family, tracking from the back door to the hallway and stopping outside the bedroom where the children slept. Just stopping, standing there, and then tracking back to the door and out into the yard where they disappeared at the tree line. I asked Prater why he still rented the house. He said because I keep hoping someone will stay long enough to satisfy it. I asked him what that meant. He said he didn't know. He said he'd owned that house for 12 years and he'd never spent a single night in it and he never would. He wished me well and hung up. I deleted the camera footage that week. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because I didn't want it on my phone anymore. I didn't want to be carrying it around with me. That image of the shape at the tree line, patient and still, waiting for the door to open, waiting for the invitation that came every night at 3:14 whether I wanted to give it or not. Some doors don't stay locked because whatever is on the other side has already been given permission to enter. Not by you, not by anyone living, by the house itself. And once that permission exists, no deadbolt in the world is going to hold. My grandfather, Vernon, lived his entire life within a 10-mile radius of the place where he was born. He grew up in a coal camp outside Mate 1, married my grandmother Opal when he was 19, worked the mines until his lungs gave him a reason to stop, and then spent the next 30 years in a house he built with his own hands, on a piece of land his father had left him on a hillside above Pigeon Creek in Mingo County. The house was simple, in the way that houses built by miners are simple. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, all on one level, set into the slope of the hill so that the front of the house sat at grade, while the back was elevated, about 4 feet above the ground on concrete block piers, creating a crawl space underneath that was accessible through a hatch in the hallway floor. Vernon lived there alone after my grandmother passed in 2014, and he died there in the fall of 2023, found in his recliner by a neighbor who noticed the mail piling up. I drove down from Huntington to handle the estate. I was the only grandchild who lived close enough and had the schedule flexibility, which in practice meant I was between jobs and had nothing better to do. The house needed to be cleared out, the utilities dealt with, the property assessed for whatever value it held. The lawyer in Williamson said it would take a couple of weeks to get through the paperwork, and rather than drive back and forth every day, I decided to stay at the house. It was still furnished, still had power and water, and despite the circumstances, it felt right to be there. Vernon and I had been close when I was younger. I'd spent summers in that house as a kid, playing in the creek and helping him in the garden, and falling asleep to the sound of the whippoorwills that lived in the woods above the property. Staying there felt like a way of saying goodbye that a funeral couldn't accomplish. The house was smaller than I remembered. Memory has a way of inflating the spaces of childhood, turning modest rooms into grand ones, and returning to Vernon's house as an adult reduced it to its true dimensions. The kitchen was barely big enough for a table and 2 chairs. The living room held a recliner, a couch, and a television on a stand, and that was all it could manage. The bedrooms were just big enough for a bed and a dresser each. The hallway that connected them was narrow and dark, with hardwood floors that had been worn smooth by decades of the same feet walking the same path. And in the center of the hallway floor, set flush with the boards, was the hatch, a 2-foot by 3-foot panel of plywood, hinged on one side, with a recessed handle that you pulled to lift it up and reveal the crawl space below. The crawl space had fascinated me as a child, and terrified me in equal measure. It was a dark, dirt-floored cavity about 3 feet high at its tallest point, supported by the concrete block piers and enclosed by the foundation walls on 3 sides with the hillside forming the 4th. Vernon used it for storage, keeping tools and spare lumber and the occasional piece of equipment down there, accessible through the hatch. As a kid, I'd lie on the hallway floor and peer down into the darkness and dare myself to go in. I never did. The space had a quality that I couldn't have articulated then but can now. It felt occupied, not by anything I could see or hear, but by the potential for occupation, the sense that a space that dark and that close to the earth was never truly empty. When I arrived, the first thing I did was close the hatch. It was open about halfway, propped up on its hinge, revealing the square of darkness below. Maybe Vernon had left it that way. Maybe the neighbor who found him had opened it while checking the house. Either way, I lowered it flat and made sure it was flush with the floor, and went about the business of settling in. I chose the guest bedroom, the smaller of the 2, because sleeping in Vernon's bed felt like a boundary I wasn't ready to cross. I made the bed with fresh sheets from the linen closet, plugged in my phone on the nightstand, and spent the first evening going through kitchen drawers and closets, sorting Vernon's possessions into categories. Keep, donate, discard. The taxonomy of a life reduced to objects. The first 4 nights were quiet. I worked during the days, boxing things up and meeting with the lawyer and making phone calls to utility companies and insurance agents. In the evenings, I'd eat something simple, watch whatever came through on the television, and go to bed around 10. The house made its noises. The water heater ticked. The floor popped in the cold. The wind moved against the siding on the uphill side where the house met the slope. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. I slept well. On the 5th night, I woke up at 3 in the morning. I don't know what woke me. There was no loud sound, no sudden change. I simply opened my eyes and was fully awake in a way that felt involuntary, as if my body had registered something that my conscious mind hadn't processed yet. I lay on my back in the dark and I listened. The room was quiet. The house was quiet. And then I heard it, a sound that I didn't recognize at first because it was so close and so low that it blended with the ambient noise of the house, the way a heartbeat blends with silence when you're lying still. It was rhythmic, organic, a slow rise and fall that took me a full minute of focused listening to identify. Breathing, deep, measured breathing, the kind that comes from a chest expanding fully and releasing slowly. And it was coming from directly beneath me, not from the floor in the general sense, not from the walls or the crawl space as a whole, from the narrow space between the mattress and the hardwood floor, from directly below the bed where I was lying. I stopped breathing myself. I held my breath and listened. The sound continued, undeniable now that I'd identified it. In, out, slow and deep, with a wetness at the edges that suggested an open mouth. The kind of breathing you do when you're lying on your back and your throat is relaxed and the air moves through an unrestricted passage. I could feel it. That's what made my blood go cold. I could feel the faintest vibration through the mattress, transmitted through the bed frame and the floor, a subtle pulse that matched the rhythm of the breath, like a bass note played through a speaker positioned directly under my body. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. A physical confirmation of something that every rational instinct in me was trying to deny. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still with my eyes open and my fists clenched at my sides, and I listened to something breathe beneath me for 20 minutes. I counted in my head. 1,200 seconds of breathing that was not my own, rising through the floor and the frame and the mattress, with a patience that suggested it had been doing this for much longer than I'd been awake to hear it. Maybe all night, maybe every night, maybe since I'd arrived. At 20 minutes, I couldn't take the stillness anymore. The paralysis broke and I rolled off the bed in a single motion, hit the floor on my feet, and slapped the light switch on the wall. The overhead light came on, harsh and yellow, flooding the room. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. The space between the floor and the bed frame was about 8 inches. Dust, a power strip, the edge of a suitcase I'd pushed under there. Nothing else. No source for the sound. No animal, no person. Nothing. I checked the room, the closet, behind the dresser, the window, which was locked. I stood in the center of the room and listened. Silence. The breathing had stopped the moment the light came on, or the moment I'd moved, or both. The room was just a room now, small and bright, and holding nothing but furniture and the smell of old carpet. I walked into the hallway, and I stopped. The hatch was open, not all the way, about 6 inches, just enough to create a gap of darkness in the hallway floor, a slot of black that looked up at me from the center of the house. I had closed it. I had closed it 5 days ago, and I hadn't opened it since. I'd walked over it multiple times a day, and it had been flat and flush with the floor every single time. Now it was open, lifted slightly on its hinge, and from the darkness below I could feel a draft of cool, earth-scented air rising through the gap. The smell of dirt and stone and moisture, and something else, something faintly organic, like the smell of a body that has been in a confined space for a long time. I got the flashlight from the kitchen. The big one, the heavy mag light that Vernon kept in the drawer beside the stove. I came back to the hatch and I pulled it open all the way, and I pointed the beam down into the crawl space. Dirt floor, concrete piers, the underside of the floor joists above, rough-cut lumber dark with age. Vernon stored items along the far wall, tools and wood and a coil of garden hose. The beam swept across the space and found nothing living. But I moved the light slowly back toward the area directly below the bedroom, the spot that corresponded to the position of the bed above, and I saw something that made me sit back on my heels and close my eyes. There was a depression in the dirt. Not a footprint, not a handprint, a body print. The full outline of a human form pressed into the soft earth, as if someone had been lying flat on their back in the dirt beneath the floor, arms at their sides, legs together, face up. The impression was deep enough and defined enough that I could see the shape of the shoulders, the curve of the hips, the indentation where the back of a head had rested against the ground. Whoever had made that impression had been lying there for a long time, long enough to compress the soil into a mold of their body, long enough that the earth had accepted their weight and shaped itself around them the way water shapes itself around a stone. And the impression was directly below the bed, directly below the mattress, directly below the spot where I'd been lying when I heard the breathing. Whoever had been down there had positioned themselves in exact alignment with my body above, separated by 3 feet of air and 6 inches of hardwood, lying in the dark beneath the house, and breathing up through the gaps in the floorboards with a patience that didn't belong to anything that needed to hurry. I closed the hatch. I nailed it shut. 4 16-penny nails driven through the plywood and into the floor joists, one in each corner. I did it at 3:30 in the morning with a hammer from Vernon's toolbox and the wild, focused energy of a person who has discovered that the barrier between themselves and something terrible is thinner than they ever imagined. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room with every light on and the television playing and Vernon's old shotgun across my knees. Not because I thought a gun would help, but because holding it made me feel like I had some measure of control over a situation that had stripped me of all control. In the morning, I drove to Williamson and told the lawyer I'd be handling the rest of the estate remotely. I didn't go back to the house. I hired a company out of Logan to clear the contents and a realtor to list the property. The house sold 3 months later to a man who wanted the land for hunting. I don't know if he lives in the house. I don't know if he found the nails in the hatch or pulled them out. I don't know if he sleeps in the bedroom above the crawl space, or if he's ever woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of something breathing beneath him with the slow, deep patience of a thing that has nowhere else to be. I think about the body print in the dirt. I think about it more often than I should. Not just the shape of it, but the implication. Someone, something, had been lying beneath that house, beneath that floor, beneath my sleeping body, and breathing. Not hiding. Not passing through. Lying still and breathing. Matching my position from below. Occupying the negative space of my body through the floor like a shadow cast downward instead of to the side. And I think about Vernon, 23 years in that house, every night in that bed. And I wonder if he heard it. I wonder if he knew. I wonder if that's why the hatch was open when I arrived. If he'd been going down there, checking the dirt, looking at the impression, and understanding that whatever left, it was still coming back, still lying beneath him in the dark, still breathing through the boards. And I wonder if the impression in the dirt was always the same shape, or if it changed. If it grew longer when Vernon grew older. If it grew thinner when Vernon lost weight in his final years. If it matched him, precisely, the way a shadow matches the body that casts it. And if it's still down there now, in the dark beneath the empty house, shaped like no one, waiting to be shaped like someone again. The cabin was my advisor's idea. Dr. Henson had been pushing me for months to find somewhere quiet to finish my thesis. A comparative analysis of folk narratives in Central Appalachian communities that I'd been working on for 2 years and had stalled on repeatedly due to what she diplomatically called distraction and what I privately called paralysis. The writing wasn't coming. Every time I sat down at my desk in my apartment in Morgantown, the noise of the building and the street and the constant low hum of other people's lives would seep through the walls and scatter whatever fragile concentration I'd managed to build. Doctor, Henson said I needed isolation. She said the best academic work she'd ever done was in a cabin in Maine, where the nearest human being was a lighthouse keeper 3 miles away. She said the silence would force the words out. She was half right. The cabin belonged to a retired professor from the English department who spent his winters in Tucson and rented the place out to graduate students at a reduced rate. It was near Lewisburg, in Greenbrier County, about 10 miles outside of town on a gravel road that wound up a hillside through hardwood forest before opening into a small clearing where the cabin sat alone like a period at the end of a long sentence. 1 bedroom on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a kitchen and bathroom, and a living room with large windows that faced south toward the tree line. The windows were the cabin's best feature, floor to almost ceiling glass that let in enormous amounts of natural light during the day and at night reflected the interior back at you like dark mirrors. The nearest neighbor was a cattle farm about 1.5 miles down the road. No cell signal, no internet. A landline phone on the kitchen wall that connected to the outside world with the tenuous reliability of rural copper wire. I moved in on a Sunday in early November. The first 3 nights were everything Dr. Henson had promised. I set up my laptop on the desk by the living room window and I wrote. The silence was extraordinary. Not the dead silence of a soundproofed room, but the living silence of a mountain clearing at night, layered with wind and distant water, and the occasional call of an owl from the ridge above the property. I worked from early afternoon until well past midnight, the words coming with a fluency that I hadn't experienced in months. I ate simple meals. I slept deeply in the downstairs bedroom. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. On the 4th night, I was at the desk around 11, deep into a section about death omens in Pocahontas County oral histories, when I glanced up from the screen. It was an involuntary movement, the kind of reflexive shift of attention that happens when your peripheral vision registers something that your conscious mind hasn't yet processed. I looked up at the window in front of me, the large south-facing glass that during the day showed the clearing and the tree line and the hillside beyond. At night, with the interior lights on, It mostly showed my own reflection and the dim shapes of the room behind me. But tonight, it showed something else. A shape, standing outside the glass, maybe 6 feet from the window, in the tall grass that grew between the cabin and the tree line. It was dark, darker than the night behind it, and it was perfectly still. Backlit by a half moon that hung above the ridge, I could see the outline clearly. Tall, thin, upright, with what appeared to be arms hanging at its sides. It was facing the window, facing me, not moving toward the cabin, not retreating, just standing there in the grass with the patience of something that had no schedule and no urgency and no intention except to watch. I sat very still at the desk and I looked at it, and it looked at me, and for maybe 30 seconds, neither of us moved. Then I reached over and turned off the desk lamp. The room went dark. Without the interior light reflecting off the glass, the window became transparent again, a clear view of the clearing, and the tree line, and the moonlit grass. The shape was gone. I pressed my face to the glass and scanned the yard. Nothing. No movement. No silhouette. No indication that anything had been standing there moments before. I told myself it was a deer, a post, a trick of the reflected light, creating a pattern that my brain interpreted as a human form. I turned the lamp back on and went back to writing, and didn't look up again until I went to bed around 1. The next night, same time, I glanced up from the laptop, and it was there. Same spot, same posture, same absolute stillness. I stared at it longer this time, maybe a full minute, trying to resolve the details. The shape was too tall for a deer and too narrow for a bear and too still for a person. People shift their weight. People breathe visibly in cold air. People move their hands or turn their heads. This shape did none of those things. It stood in the grass like it had been planted there, and it watched the window with an intensity I could feel through the glass, a focused, directional attention that pressed against the window like a hand pressing against a pane. I turned off the light. The shape vanished, or rather, it was no longer visible. Whether it actually left or simply became invisible in the dark was a question I didn't want to answer. On the 6th night, I closed the curtains before dark, heavy fabric curtains that the professor had installed, thick enough to block light completely. I pulled them across every window in the cabin and worked at the desk by lamplight with the glass hidden behind fabric. But I could feel it, the same pressure, the same directional attention pressing against the window from outside, transmitted through the glass and the curtain and the air between us. I got up once, around midnight, and put my hand against the curtain. The fabric was cold. Not the uniform cold of glass exposed to November air. Cold in one spot. A concentrated chill in the center of the window, roughly at the height of a person's face, as if something on the other side was standing close enough to the glass to cool it with its presence. On the 7th night, I made a decision that I've questioned every day since. I left the curtains open. I positioned my chair so that I was facing the window directly. Laptop closed, desk lamp on, and I watched. I wanted to see it arrive. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with, whether it was an animal or a person or a figment of my exhausted imagination. At 11:40 it appeared. Not suddenly, not like something stepping out from behind the trees. It emerged from the tree line the way a shadow extends when the light source moves. A gradual darkening at the forest's edge that condensed into a shape and then separated from the trees and began to move across the yard. It walked in a straight line from the tree line toward the window. No deviation, no hesitation. A direct, purposeful approach that covered the 50 feet between the forest and the cabin in maybe 30 seconds. It stopped 3 feet from the glass. I could see it more clearly now than I had on any previous night. It was tall, well over 6 feet, and thin in a way that didn't look healthy, the proportions of a body that had been stretched or starved into an elongated silhouette. The arms hung slightly forward of the body, the way arms hang when the shoulders are rounded and the posture is collapsed. The head was tilted slightly, not cocked to one side but angled forward, chin down, as if it was looking at the window from beneath a brow I couldn't see. I couldn't make out features, no face, no eyes, no expression. Just the outline, the form, the unmistakable shape of something that had once been, or still was, or wanted to be human. It stood there for 2 hours. I sat at my desk, and it stood outside my window, and we watched each other across 3 feet of glass and the entire distance between whatever world it inhabited and whatever world I thought I was safe in. It didn't move. Not a shift of weight, not a tilt of the head, not the faintest adjustment of posture. For 2 hours, it maintained a stillness that no living body could sustain, the kind of absolute motionlessness that belongs to objects rather than organisms, to statues and trees and things that don't have muscles that fatigue or lungs that expand. I didn't sleep. I sat at that desk until the sky began to lighten behind the ridge and the first gray wash of dawn crept across the clearing. As the light changed, the shape didn't retreat. It didn't dissolve. It simply became less visible as the contrast between its darkness and the surrounding darkness diminished, fading into the growing light the way a shadow fades when the sun reaches it. By the time the clearing was fully lit, it was gone. But it had left something behind. I went outside in the morning light, coffee in hand, and walked to the spot where it had been standing. The ground beneath the window was soft from recent rain, the kind of dark mountain soil that holds impressions clearly. I expected footprints. What I found was worse. There were no footprints. There were knee prints. 2 deep, oval depressions in the soft earth, positioned side by side about a foot apart, directly below the window. The impressions were deep, sunk 3 or 4 inches into the soil, with the compressed texture that comes from sustained weight bearing down over a long period. Whatever had been outside my window hadn't been standing. It had been kneeling. The shape I'd seen silhouetted against the moonlight, tall and thin and upright, had been the upper body of something on its knees, which meant the full height of whatever it was extended well beyond what I'd estimated. If it had been standing, it would have been enormous. But it wasn't the size that kept me rooted to that spot in the morning light, staring at the impressions in the dirt. It was the depth. The knee prints were too deep, too settled, too compressed to have been made in a single night. They had the character of impressions that had been reinforced over time, the same knees in the same position, night after night, pressing deeper into the soil with each visit. Whatever had been kneeling outside my window had been doing it long before I arrived. Long before I'd first seen it on the 4th night. Possibly since the beginning. Possibly since the cabin was built. I packed my things that morning. I drove back to Morgantown and finished my thesis in the university library, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the sound of other students breathing and the blessed, beautiful noise of human beings going about their ordinary lives. I never went back to the cabin. I told Dr. Henson the isolation was too much, and she nodded and didn't push. The thesis was published. It got decent reviews. Nobody who read it noticed that the section on death omens was shorter than the others, truncated, unfinished. I couldn't complete it, because the folk narratives I'd been analyzing, the stories about watchers in the woods and presences outside windows, and the feeling of being observed by something that doesn't blink, stopped being academic material the night I sat at a desk in a cabin in Greenbrier County and watched something kneel outside my window for 2 hours in the dark. Those stories aren't folklore, they're field reports. And the thing about field reports is that they don't end when the researcher leaves. The data keeps accumulating, the subject keeps behaving. The knee prints keep getting deeper in the soft ground, beneath a window that looks into a room where the desk lamp is off and the chair is empty and the laptop is closed, and whatever kneels there in the dark is still watching, still waiting, still patient, because it was there before me, and it will be there after. And the only thing that's changed is that now it knows what it looks like from the other side of the glass. My great-aunt Lenora was the last of her generation in our family. She outlived her husband by 32 years, her siblings by at least a decade each, and most of the neighbors and friends who had populated the world she grew up in. By the time she died at 94 in the winter of 2024, she had been living alone in her house in Monroe County for so long that solitude had become less a condition than an identity. The house was a white clapboard farmhouse on a ridge road between Union and Linside, set back from the pavement on a lot that was bordered by pasture on 2 sides and forest on the 3rd. It had been built by her husband's family sometime before the First World War and had been continuously occupied by Stricklands ever since, which made Lenora the final resident in a line that stretched back over a century. I inherited the house because I was the only one who wanted it. My parents were settled in Roanoke. My brother lived in Charlotte. My cousins had scattered across the mid-Atlantic, in the way that mountain families scatter when the economics of staying no longer outweigh the pull of opportunity elsewhere. Nobody wanted a farmhouse in Monroe County that needed a new roof and hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. But I was 28 and working remotely as a freelance copy editor, and the idea of living rent-free in a house with good bones and a view of the Alleghenies was appealing enough to override the practical concerns. I moved in 3 weeks after the funeral, bringing a carload of belongings into a house still furnished with everything Lenora had owned. She had been a collector in the quiet way that people of her generation were, accumulating objects not for their value but for their permanence. The house was full of things that had been in the same position for decades. Dishes in the china cabinet that hadn't been used since the 70s. Framed photographs on every wall, the glass clouded with age. Rugs that had worn through in the high-traffic areas and been repaired with stitching that was itself decades old. And in the hallway, standing against the wall between the parlor and the kitchen like a sentinel, the grandfather clock. It was a tall case clock, maybe 7 feet, built from dark walnut with a glass-fronted pendulum cabinet and a painted face that showed Roman numerals, and a moon phase dial that had been stuck on a waxing crescent for as long as anyone could remember. The pendulum was a brass disc, the size of a saucer, hanging motionless behind the glass. The hands were frozen at 4:17, the minute hand between the 3 and the 4, the hour hand just past the 4. According to my mother, who had heard it from Lenora, the clock had stopped working sometime in the late 80s. Nobody knew exactly when or why. Lenora had never had it repaired. She simply left it where it was, a tall, dark shape in the hallway that you walked past a dozen times a day without thinking about, the way you stop thinking about any fixture that's been in the same place long enough to become invisible. I left the clock alone when I moved in. It felt like part of the house in a way that the other furniture didn't. Moving it would have been like removing a wall or filling in a window, a structural change that would alter the character of the building in a way I wasn't prepared to authorize. So it stood there in the hallway, silent and still, and I walked past it every day and gave it no more thought than I gave the floorboards or the door frames. February came cold and hard, the way February comes to the Alleghenies when the jet stream dips south and the wind cuts across the ridges with a sharpness that makes your eyes water. I'd settled into a routine by then. Work during the day at the kitchen table, where the light was best. Read by the fireplace in the parlor at night, with the wood stove going and a blanket over my legs, and the kind of deep, encompassing quiet that you can only find in a house at the end of a road where nobody comes unless they mean to. It was a Tuesday night. I remember that specifically because I'd spent the day editing a particularly tedious manuscript about supply chain logistics, and my brain felt wrung out and empty, and the only thing I wanted was to sit by the fire and read something that had nothing to do with shipping containers. I was in the parlor, in the chair that had been Lenora's, with a novel open on my lap when I heard it. A chime. A single, deep, resonant tone that came from the hallway and filled the house the way a church bell fills a valley, not with volume but with presence. The sound had a weight to it, a physical quality that I felt in my chest and my teeth. It rang for maybe 3 seconds, and then faded into a silence that felt different from the silence before it, charged and expectant, like the air after lightning. I set the book down and walked into the hallway. The grandfather clock was running. The pendulum, which had been motionless for over 30 years, was swinging. Slow, steady arcs, the brass disc catching the light from the parlor as it passed through the bottom of its swing. The second hand was moving, ticking forward with the precise, measured advancement of a mechanism in perfect working order. And the time on the face read 12:01. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked. 12:01. The clock was keeping perfect time. I stood in the hallway and watched it. The ticking filled the space with a rhythm that the house hadn't known in decades, a heartbeat restored to a body that had been lying still. The pendulum swung with a smoothness that suggested freshly oiled works, a movement so fluid and consistent that it seemed impossible for a mechanism that had been dormant for 30+ years. Clocks don't do this. I knew that with the basic mechanical understanding that anyone develops from living in a world of objects. Springs lose tension, gears corrode, lubricants dry out and harden. A clock that stops working in 1988 doesn't spontaneously resume operation in 2024 without intervention. without someone opening the case and cleaning the works and winding the mainspring and setting the pendulum in motion. But there it was, running, ticking, keeping time with an accuracy that my phone confirmed minute by minute as I stood there watching. 12:05, 12:10, 12:15, each minute marked with a quiet click as the minute hand advanced. The moon phase dial, which had been stuck on a waxing crescent since before I was born, was showing what appeared to be a full moon. I didn't know if that was accurate. I didn't check. I watched the clock for an hour. It ran without interruption, without variation, without a single irregularity in the rhythm of its ticking or the swing of its pendulum. At 12:30 it chimed once for the half hour, the same deep, resonant tone that had drawn me from the parlor, and the sound hung in the hallway air, like something you could reach out and touch. At 1:17 the clock stopped. The pendulum froze mid-swing, the brass disc halting at the leftmost extent of its arc and hanging there, motionless, as if someone had reached into the case and grabbed it. The ticking ceased. The second hand locked. The minute hand stopped between the 3 and the 4. The hour hand rested just past the 1. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a quiet house. It was the silence of something that had been present and was now absent. The kind of silence that carries the shape of what came before it, the way a room carries the warmth of a person who just left. I stood in the hallway for a long time after the clock stopped. I was trying to process what I'd experienced in rational terms, and failing. Clocks don't fix themselves. Clocks don't run for 76 minutes and then stop at a specific time. Nothing about what had just happened fit any mechanical explanation I could construct. And the feeling in the house had changed. The air in the hallway was different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity. It felt occupied, not by anything I could see, but by the residue of something that had been there, moving through the house for 76 minutes, using the clock as a medium the way a voice uses a telephone. I went back to the parlor and sat in the chair, and I didn't sleep. I watched the fire burn down to embers, and the embers fade to ash, and the room slowly darken as the last heat left the stove and the February cold crept back in through the walls. In the morning, I got up and went through the house the way you do after something has disrupted the order of your world, checking every room, every window, every door, looking for something that had changed, something that would explain or anchor the experience in something tangible. I found it on the mantel above the fireplace, a photograph. It was in a small wooden frame, propped against the wall behind a pair of brass candlesticks where I hadn't noticed it before, which was possible, given the sheer number of photographs Lenora had accumulated over the decades. But I'd been sitting in the chair directly facing the mantel all evening. I'd been looking at it for hours, and I was fairly certain the photograph hadn't been there when I sat down. It showed two people standing on the front porch of the house. The photograph was old, black and white, with the slightly overexposed quality of amateur photography from the mid-20th century. One of the people was Lenora, young, maybe 30, with her hair pinned back in a cotton dress and the composed, direct gaze that she'd carried her entire life. The other was a man, tall, thin, dark-haired, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and trousers held up by suspenders. He was standing close to Lenora, close enough that their arms touched, and his posture suggested familiarity, intimacy, the ease of someone who belonged beside the person they were standing next to. He was not Lenora's husband. I'd seen enough photographs of Lenora's husband, a man named Harold Strickland who died in 1992, to know his face. This man was not Harold. He was taller, thinner, with sharper features and darker eyes and an expression that was not a smile. It was something else. Something that might have been satisfaction or anticipation or the look of someone who has arrived at a place they've been trying to reach for a long time. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as Lenora's, neat and slanted with the careful penmanship of a woman educated in a one-room schoolhouse, were 4 words and a date. He came back at midnight. The date was partially smudged. The ink faded to the point where I could make out the month, February, and what might have been a year in the 1950s or 60s, but nothing more specific. I put the photograph back on the mantel, I sat in the chair and I looked at it and I thought about the clock running for 76 minutes in the middle of the night after 3 decades of silence. I thought about the chime at 12:01 and the stopping at 1:17 and the way the silence afterward felt like a departure. And I thought about Lenora, living alone in this house for 32 years after Harold died, with a clock in the hallway that didn't work, and a photograph on the mantle of a man who wasn't her husband, and a note on the back that said he came back at midnight. The clock hasn't run again. It stands in the hallway where it's always stood, pendulum still, hands frozen, and I walk past it every day. But I've started noticing something. The time on the face changes. Not while I'm watching. Never while I'm looking directly at it. But I'll walk past in the morning and the hands will be at 4:17, where they've always been. And I'll walk past in the evening and they'll be at a different position. Subtle changes. A minute forward, 2 minutes back. As if the clock is keeping time in a way I can't observe, running only when no one is looking, measuring something that happens in the spaces between attention. And on certain nights, usually in February, usually when the wind is cutting across the ridge and the house is cold and the fire has burned low, I hear it. Not the chime, not the ticking, just a single sound, faint and low, from the hallway where the clock stands. The sound of a pendulum beginning to swing. One arc, two, and then nothing, as if something is testing the mechanism, checking to see if it still works, making sure the door is still there for the next time he comes back at midnight. I found the house on a foreclosure listing website in the spring of 2023. I'd been looking for months, saving what I could from my job at a lumber yard in Lewisburg, searching for something cheap enough that I could buy it outright without a mortgage and fix it up with my own hands over time. I didn't need much. I was 31, single, no kids, and the only requirement I had was that the place be mine. After years of renting apartments and rooms in shared houses, where the landlord's rules governed every decision from paint color to pet ownership, I wanted a door I could walk through and know that everything on the other side belonged to me. The listing said Summers County, 3 acres, 2-bedroom house, foreclosure, as-is condition. The price was $11,000. Even for rural West Virginia, that was almost nothing. The photos on the listing were sparse and unflattering, showing a small house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned since the previous decade. But the description mentioned a stone foundation, hardwood floors, and a metal roof, which meant the bones were good even if the cosmetics were bad. I drove down on a Saturday to look at it. The house sat on a county road about 8 miles outside of Hinton, on a piece of land that sloped gently toward a creek at the back of the property. 3 acres of mixed pasture and woodland, bordered by state road right-of-way on one side and larger agricultural parcels on the other 3. The house itself was small, maybe 900 square feet, a story and a half with 2 bedrooms upstairs and the living space downstairs. It had been built sometime in the 40s, based on the construction style, balloon frame, with stone foundation walls that extended about 4 feet above grade to form a partial cellar beneath the main floor. The paint was gone on the south side, the porch sagged, and the yard was knee-high with weeds. But the roof was intact. The foundation was dry, and when I pushed open the front door and walked through the rooms, the floors were level and the walls were plumb, and the structure felt solid in the way that well-built houses feel solid, even when everything cosmetic has fallen apart. I bought it, paid cash at the courthouse, and had the deed recorded that same week. I moved in with a sleeping bag, a camp stove, a toolbox, and the unearned confidence of a man who believed that hard work and YouTube tutorials could compensate for a complete lack of renovation experience. The first 2 weeks were consumed by the upstairs. I stripped wallpaper, pulled carpet, patched plaster, and replaced the wiring in both bedrooms with the help of an electrician from Hinton who owed a favor to a friend of a friend. I worked from dawn until I lost the light, eating sandwiches and canned food and sleeping on the floor in my sleeping bag with the particular satisfaction of a man who is tired for the right reasons. I didn't go into the cellar during those first 2 weeks. The door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden slab set into the stone foundation wall, and it was swollen shut. The wood expanded from moisture to the point where the latch barely engaged, and the frame gripped the door on all sides like a fist. I had other priorities. The cellar could wait. I assumed it was a dirt-floored storage space common to houses of this era, useful eventually for keeping tools or canned goods, but not essential to the immediate work of making the upstairs livable. On the 15th day, I decided to open it. I'd finished the major upstairs work and was moving on to the kitchen, and I needed to assess the cellar for moisture issues that might affect the floor above. I put my shoulder against the door and pushed. It resisted, the swollen wood grinding against the frame, and then gave way with a sudden release that nearly sent me stumbling down the stone steps on the other side. The smell came up the stairs like something that had been waiting. Not rot, not mildew, not the damp mineral scent of a stone cellar with a dirt floor. This was human. Body heat and sweat and unwashed fabric and the thick, accumulated musk of a living person existing in an enclosed space for a long time without ventilation or hygiene. It was the smell of a body, not dead but deeply present, the olfactory signature of someone who had been sleeping and breathing and sweating in this space long enough that their chemistry had soaked into the stone and the dirt and the air itself. I stood at the top of the stairs and breathed through my mouth and looked down. The cellar was dim, lit only by the kitchen light behind me, and whatever ambient glow made it through the single small window at ground level on the far wall. I could see stone walls, a dirt floor, the rough-hewn joists of the kitchen floor above. I went back for my flashlight and descended. The cellar was roughly the size of the kitchen above it, maybe 12 by 14 feet, with stone walls about 6 feet high and a dirt floor that was dry but soft, the kind of packed earth that holds impressions. The single window was about 12 inches tall and 18 inches wide, set at ground level in the far wall. It was covered from the inside with cardboard, a piece of brown corrugated board cut to fit the window frame and held in place with strips of duct tape along all 4 edges. The cardboard blocked all light and all view, turning the cellar into a sealed, lightless chamber. On the floor, in the far corner, beneath the covered window, was a mattress. Not a bed frame, just a mattress, twin-sized, laid directly on the dirt. It was stained and compressed and old, but it was a mattress, placed there deliberately, positioned with its head end against the wall, and a bunched-up jacket serving as a pillow. Beside the mattress was a plastic gallon jug, the kind that milk comes in, half full of water. Beside that, a plastic grocery bag containing empty aluminum cans, maybe a dozen of them, various brands of soup and beans and Vienna sausages. The cans had been opened with a manual can opener and the lids were bent back and the interiors were dry, suggesting they'd been emptied and set aside over a period of time rather than consumed all at once. Someone had been living here, in this cellar, on this mattress, eating canned food and drinking water from a jug, in a room sealed against outside light and accessed through a door that opened into the kitchen of a house that had been sitting vacant for 18 months. I swept the flashlight across the space slowly, checking every corner, every shadow. Whoever had been here wasn't here now. The mattress was cold. The air was stale. The smell was residual, the ghost of a presence rather than the presence itself. But it was recent, months maybe, not years. I turned back toward the stairs, and that's when the flashlight beam crossed the cellar door. The inside surface, the side that faced the cellar when the door was closed, and I stopped. The wood was covered in scratches, hundreds of them, long, parallel gouges that ran vertically along the surface, concentrated around the handle and the latch area, but extending outward in every direction, some reaching almost to the edges of the door. They were deep, cut into the grain by something hard and sharp, fingernails or a piece of metal, applied with enough force to tear through the surface of the wood and expose the pale interior beneath. Some of the scratches were short and frantic, clustered in tight groups that suggested rapid, panicked motion. Others were long and deliberate, single strokes drawn from top to bottom with a steadiness that implied purpose rather than desperation. I stared at the door. The scratches weren't on the outside. They were on the inside, the cellar side, made by someone standing in the cellar, facing the door, working at the wood surface around the handle and latch. The natural assumption would be that someone trapped in the cellar had been trying to scratch their way out. But the door opened outward, into the kitchen. If you were standing in the cellar and you wanted to leave, you'd push the door open. There was no lock on the outside, no padlock, no hasp, no bolt, just a simple latch that engaged when the door closed and released when you turned the handle from either side. Nobody was locked in. The door wasn't barred, which meant the scratches weren't from someone trying to get out. They were from someone trying to hold the door shut. Someone standing on the cellar side, gripping the handle, bracing against the door, scratching at the wood around the latch in the frantic effort to keep the door closed, to keep something in the kitchen from opening it, to keep something on the other side from coming down. I called the sheriff's office in Hinton. A deputy named Lester drove out that afternoon, a middle-aged man with a patient demeanor and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen rural strangeness before and wasn't easily impressed. He looked at the cellar. He looked at the mattress and the water jug and the cans. He took some photographs. He told me it was squatters. Said it happened all the time in foreclosed properties. People with nowhere to go finding an empty house and moving in until someone noticed or the property changed hands. He said it was unfortunate, but not unusual, and there wasn't much to be done about it after the fact, since whoever had been there was gone. I asked him about the scratches on the door. He looked at them for a long time. He ran his fingers over the gouges the way a person reads Braille, feeling the depth and the direction and the force behind them. He stood in the cellar and he looked at the door, and I could see him working through the same logic I had. The door opens outward. The scratches are on the inside. The handle shows the most concentrated damage. Whoever made these marks was trying to hold the door closed from the cellar side. He was quiet for a while. Then he said maybe they were afraid of someone finding them. Maybe they heard someone upstairs and panicked and tried to keep the door shut so they wouldn't be discovered. It was a reasonable explanation delivered in a reasonable tone by a man who wanted to give me a reasonable answer and go back to the office. But his eyes didn't match his voice. His eyes were on the mattress in the corner, and the covered window, and the sealed, lightless space where someone had chosen to live in the dark rather than risk whatever was on the other side of that door. I thanked him, and he left. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the cellar door, now open, the scratched interior surface visible in the afternoon light. I looked at the handle and the latch and the marks around them, the evidence of hands gripping and pulling and clawing at wood in the effort to keep the door from being opened. And I thought about what it would take to make a person live like that. In a cellar, in the dark, on a mattress on the dirt, eating cold food from cans and drinking water from a jug and covering the window with cardboard so that even the faint light of the outside world couldn't get in. And scratching at the door, not to get out, to stay in, to seal themselves into the darkest, smallest, most hidden space in the house, because whatever was upstairs, whatever walked the kitchen floor above them, was something they couldn't face, something they'd rather starve in the dark than encounter. I live in the house now. I renovated the kitchen, I fixed the porch, I painted the exterior, and replaced the windows, and turned the property into something I'm proud of. I sealed the cellar door with new weather stripping so it doesn't swell shut anymore, and I used the space for storage the way it was intended. I cleaned out the mattress and the cans and the water jug, and I scrubbed the walls and the floor until the smell was gone. But I didn't replace the door. The scratches are still there, on the inside surface, hidden when the door is closed but visible whenever I open it to go downstairs. I see them every time, and every time I think about the person who made them, not who they were. I'll probably never know that, but what they knew, what they understood about this house that I don't, what walked the kitchen floor above them in the dark, while they lay on a mattress in the cellar and held the door shut with everything they had, because they didn't leave. That's the part that I keep coming back to. They didn't run. They didn't abandon the cellar and flee into the night. They stayed. They lived in that space for what must have been weeks or months, sealed in the dark, because leaving meant going upstairs. And going upstairs meant opening the door. And whatever was waiting on the other side of that door was worse than hunger and darkness, and the slow erosion of sanity that comes from living in a hole in the ground beneath a house where something else lives above you. I sleep upstairs now, in the bedroom I renovated, in the house I own. And most nights, it's fine. The house is quiet, and the road is quiet, and the property feels like mine. But some nights, usually the cold ones, usually when the wind pushes against the siding and the house creaks in ways that almost sound like footsteps, I lie in bed and I listen. And I hear the cellar door rattle, just slightly, just enough to tell me that whatever is on one side is testing the latch from the other, and I don't know which side I should be afraid of. I bought the house in Pocahontas County in June of 2022 from an estate sale managed by a bank in Marlinton. The previous owner had died without heirs, which in these mountains happens more often than you'd think. The last person in a family line passing quietly in a house that's been there for generations, leaving behind a property that nobody claims, and the bank eventually sells to recover whatever is owed. The house was on a road that followed the Greenbrier River north of Durban, set back from the pavement on a lot, shaded by white oaks, so large they must have been there before the house was built. White clapboard, 2 stories, a front porch with turned posts, and a swing hanging from chains that creaked when the wind caught them. It was the kind of house that appears on postcards of Appalachian country life, charming from a distance, requiring a significant investment of labor and money up close. But the price was right, and I had both, having sold a property in Northern Virginia that netted me enough to buy this place outright and fund the renovation. I moved in incrementally over the first week, hauling boxes from a rented trailer and stacking them in rooms that I'd get to as the work progressed. The house was mostly empty. The estate sale had cleared out the furniture and personal effects, or most of them. What remained were the things that estate sales don't bother with: curtain rods, light fixtures, a few pieces of hardware, and a handful of items that had been left behind, either intentionally or by oversight. Among these was a framed photograph on the wall of the upstairs bedroom, the room I'd chosen as my own because it was the largest and had 2 windows that caught the morning light. The photograph was a black and white image, roughly 8 by 10, in a simple wooden frame that had been stained dark to match the trim in the room. It showed the house, my house, taken from the front yard, from a position that I could approximate by standing about 30 feet from the porch and centering the frame on the front door. The house in the photograph looked much as it did now. White clapboard, front porch, the swing hanging from its chains. There was a car parked in the driveway, a rounded, chrome-heavy sedan that I placed somewhere in the mid-1950s based on the styling. The trees were smaller, the yard was tidier, but the house was unmistakably the same structure I was standing in. It was a photograph of my house as it had existed 70 years ago, hung on the wall of the room where it was taken, a piece of the building's autobiography left behind for whoever came next. I left it where it was. It seemed right. The photograph belonged to the house, the way the foundation belonged to the house, a piece of its identity that predated my ownership and would outlast it. Taking it down felt presumptuous, like erasing a chapter from someone else's story. So it stayed on the wall above the dresser, and I walked past it every morning and every evening, and gave it the kind of absent glance you give any familiar object that occupies a fixed position in your daily landscape. I noticed the first change about a week after I moved in. I was getting dressed in the morning, standing at the dresser, and I looked up at the photograph the way I always did. The house, the yard, the car, the porch, everything in its place. But the front door was open. Not wide open, ajar. A dark gap between the door and the frame, maybe 6 or 8 inches, showing the shadow of the interior hallway beyond. I stood there and looked at it and felt a small, quiet disturbance in my chest. The kind of sensation you get when something in your environment has shifted and you can't immediately identify what. I was certain the door had been closed in the photograph. I'd looked at the image dozens of times over the past week, and the front door had been a solid white rectangle, closed flush with the frame, matching the clapboard on either side. Now it was open. I told myself I was wrong. Memory is unreliable, especially for details you're not actively paying attention to. I'd been busy with the renovation, distracted, tired. I'd probably glanced at the photograph without really seeing it, and constructed a mental image that didn't match reality. The door had always been open. I'd simply failed to notice. I accepted this explanation and moved on. 3 days later, I looked again. The porch swing was gone. The chains that had held it were still there, hanging from the ceiling of the porch, but the swing itself had vanished. Just the chains, hanging empty, 2 dark lines descending from the porch ceiling to a point where the seat should have been and terminating in nothing. I stood in front of the photograph for a long time. I tried to construct a rational explanation. Maybe the swing had been absent in the original and I'd imagined it because the real swing was hanging on the real porch outside. Maybe the chains had always been empty and my brain had filled in the missing piece because it expected to see a complete object. But I knew I knew the way you know your own handwriting, or the sound of your own voice. The swing had been there, and now it wasn't. I began checking the photograph every day, deliberately, carefully, noting the details with the focused attention of someone cataloging evidence. For 4 days, nothing changed. The house sat in its yard with its open door, and its empty chains, and its 1950s sedan and the oak trees and the tidy grass, and everything looked exactly the way it had looked the last time I'd checked. I almost relaxed. I almost convinced myself that the changes were complete, and the photograph had settled into its final form, and whatever trick of perception or memory had caused the discrepancies was over. On the 5th day, I looked at the photograph and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath my feet. One of the upstairs windows, the window on the left side of the house, the window that in reality was 3 feet from where the photograph hung on my bedroom wall, had a shape behind it, not a figure, not a person in any clearly defined sense. A darkening of the glass, a density that hadn't been there before, like someone standing inside the room looking out through the window at the camera in the yard below. The shape was vague, indistinct, visible only as a subtle variation in the tone of the window glass, lighter at the edges and darker at the center where a face might be. It could have been a shadow, it could have been a flaw in the glass or the photographic process. But it was new, it hadn't been there before, and it was in the window of my room, the room where the photograph hung, the room where I was standing right now, looking at an image of someone looking out. The thing about the changes was that they were irreversible. Each time I noticed something different, the photograph looked like it had always been that way. There was no before and after, no evidence of alteration. The image presented itself with the absolute conviction of an original, a photograph that had been taken in the 1950s and had existed in this exact form ever since. The open door looked like it had been captured mid-swing by the photographer. The empty chains looked like they'd been photographed during a period when the swing was removed for repair. The shape in the window looked like a person who had been standing inside the house when the picture was taken and had simply been too far from the glass to register as more than a shadow. Each change was plausible in isolation. It was only in sequence, only in the accumulating awareness that the photograph was different today than it had been yesterday, that the wrongness became undeniable. I took the photograph down. I lifted it off the nail and carried it to the hallway closet and placed it face down on the shelf between a stack of old towels and a box of light bulbs. I closed the closet door. I went back to the bedroom and looked at the wall where it had hung. A faint rectangle of slightly brighter paint marked its position, the ghost of decades of protecting the wall behind it from fading. I went to bed that night with the photograph in the closet and the wall bare, and a feeling of control that lasted approximately 7 hours. In the morning, the photograph was back on the wall. Same nail, same position, same frame. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at it and felt something drain out of me, some reserve of rationality or defiance that had been sustaining my ability to process what was happening. The photograph was on the wall. I had put it in the closet. I had closed the closet door, and now it was back, hanging precisely where it had hung for decades, as if I had never touched it. I walked to the photograph and looked at it closely. The house, the yard, the open door, the empty chains, the upstairs window, the shape behind the glass, everything as it had been the day before, except the shape was larger. It filled more of the window. The darkening had expanded from a vague center point to an area that occupied most of the glass, as if whoever was standing inside had moved closer, stepped forward, pressed nearer to the window. The outline was still indistinct, but it was bigger now, more present, and if I looked at it long enough, I could almost make out the suggestion of features. Not a face, not yet, but the architecture of a face. The places where eyes and a mouth and a nose would be if the resolution improved by just 1 more degree. I took the photograph down again. This time, I didn't put it in the closet. I put it in my truck. I drove it to the hardware store in Marlinton and left it in the cab and went inside and bought a new hook for the wall, the kind with an adhesive backing that didn't require a nail. I hung a landscape print I'd brought from Virginia on the wall where the photograph had been, and I left the old frame in the truck overnight. In the morning, the landscape print was on the floor, leaning against the baseboard. The photograph was back on the wall. Same nail, same position. The landscape print's adhesive hook was still attached to the wall, the print having been removed from it carefully, not torn or dropped, but lifted off and set aside. And in the photograph, the shape in the window was clearer, not by much, but enough. The suggestion of features had resolved slightly, like a face coming into focus through fog. I could see what might have been the line of a jaw, the hollow of eye sockets, the darker area where a mouth would be if it were open, if it were smiling. I stopped taking the photograph down. There didn't seem to be any point. Whatever principle governed its attachment to that wall was stronger than my will to remove it, and each time I tried, the shape in the window grew more defined, as if my resistance was accelerating whatever process was underway. So I left it. I live with it. I sleep in the room where it hangs, and I pass it every morning and every evening, and I look at it the way I look at everything in the house, with the careful, measured attention of a man who has learned that the things around him are not as fixed as they appear. The shape in the window is still growing. It's larger now than it was a month ago, more defined. I can see the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of hands, possibly pressed against the glass from inside. And sometimes in the evening, when the light in the bedroom shifts and the angle catches the photograph just right, I see something that makes my breath stop. The shape isn't looking out at the yard where the camera would have been. It's looking to the side, toward the wall, toward the exact spot in the room where the photograph hangs, toward me, as if whoever is in that window has been turning, slowly, degree by degree, adjusting their gaze from the original photographer to the current occupant. And one morning I'm going to look at that photograph, and the face will be clear and the eyes will be open, and they will be looking directly out of the frame at the room where I'm standing. And I will finally see who has been living in the house in the photograph, and they will finally see who has been living in theirs. I've lived alone for most of my adult life. Not by design exactly, more by temperament. I'm the kind of person who recharges in silence and depletes in company. And after a string of relationships in my 20s that all ended with some version of "you're impossible to reach," I stopped trying to convince anyone otherwise and accepted that my particular configuration of personality was better suited to solitude than partnership. I bought a house at the end of a ridge road in Greenbrier County when I was 34, a small two-bedroom place with a metal roof and a porch that looked out across a valley where the morning fog pooled like milk. I work remotely for a surveying company, processing field data and generating plat maps on my computer, which means I can go days without seeing another person if I choose to, and I often choose to. Bo changed the equation. I got him as a rescue when he was 2, a hound mix with a broad chest and floppy ears and the calm, steady temperament of a dog who had figured out early that the world was mostly fine if you didn't overthink it. He weighed 80 pounds and moved through life with the easy confidence of a creature that had never met a situation it couldn't handle by either investigating it or lying down near it. He went everywhere in the house, slept on the bed, usually with his head on the pillow next to mine, followed me from room to room with the patient fidelity of a shadow. When I went outside, he went outside. When I moved to the kitchen, he moved to the kitchen. He had explored every inch of the house and the property by the end of his first week and had found nothing that concerned him. That's why I noticed when he stopped going down the hallway. The house is simple in layout. Front door opens into the living room, kitchen off to the right. A hallway leads straight back from the living room to the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom. The hallway is maybe 15 feet long, hardwood floor, with the bathroom on the left and the 2 bedrooms at the end, one on each side. The transition from living room to hallway is marked by a change in flooring. Carpet in the living room, hardwood in the hall, and a slight drop in ceiling height where the original structure meets an addition that was built sometime in the 70s. It started on a Thursday evening in the first week of October 2024. I was heading to the back bedroom to grab a book I'd left on the nightstand. Bo was behind me, the way he always was, his nails clicking on the carpet as he followed. I stepped into the hallway, felt the hardwood under my feet, and took 3 or 4 steps before I realized the clicking had stopped. I turned around. Bo was sitting at the threshold, right at the line where the carpet ended and the hardwood began. He was sitting upright, ears forward, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead of me, not on me, past me, down the hallway toward the bedrooms, and he wasn't moving. I called his name. He didn't respond, not a flick of the ear, not a glance in my direction. His attention was locked on the hallway with an intensity I'd never seen from him. I called again, patting my thigh the way I always did when I wanted him to follow. Nothing. I walked back to the threshold and knelt down and put my hand on his head. His body was tense. Not shaking, not cowering, but rigid, every muscle engaged, the way a dog's body gets when it's processing something that requires its full biological attention. I could feel his heartbeat through the top of his skull, faster than normal but steady. He wasn't afraid. Or if he was, it was a measured, controlled fear. The kind that an animal feels when it has assessed a threat and determined that the appropriate response is not to flee, but to hold position. To not go further, to not cross that line. I put a treat on the hallway floor, 3 feet from where he sat. A piece of jerky, his favorite, the thing he would normally cross a room to get before I finished reaching for the bag. He looked at the treat. He looked down the hallway, and then he looked at me. And the expression on his face was something I've never seen on a dog before, and hope I never see again. It wasn't the blank look of an animal that doesn't understand. It was the loaded, communicative look of a creature that understands perfectly and is trying to convey something across the species barrier with the only tools it has. His eyes moved from mine to the hallway and back to mine, and the message was as clear as if he'd spoken it. Don't go down there. Please don't go down there. I got the book myself and came back, and Bo was waiting at the threshold, tail wagging once when I returned to the living room, and the rest of the evening was normal. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Maybe he'd heard a mouse in the wall or smelled something unfamiliar carried in through a gap in the baseboard. Dogs are sensitive to things we can't detect. Their world is built on a foundation of scent and sound that makes ours look like a rough sketch. But the next evening, same thing. I walked toward the hallway, and Bo stopped at the threshold. Same posture, same fixed gaze, same absolute refusal to cross. And the evening after that, and every evening since. 3 weeks now. Every night, as soon as the light outside begins to fade and the house transitions from its daytime self to its nighttime self, Bo stops going down the hallway. During the day, he's fine. He follows me to the bedroom, lies on the bed, sniffs around the bathroom, does all the things he's always done. But once the sun drops below the ridge and the shadows in the hallway deepen and the house settles into the particular quiet that mountain homes have after dark, Bo sits at that threshold and will not move. I tried everything. I carried him down the hallway one night, all 80 pounds, and set him on the bedroom floor. He walked straight back out, down the hall, and sat at the threshold again, looking back at me with that same expression. I closed the bedroom door, with both of us inside. He stood at the door and stared at it, not scratching, not whining, just staring, his body oriented toward the hallway on the other side, as if he could see through the wood. I opened the door, and he walked back to the living room and sat down at the line and didn't move. I started sleeping on the couch, not because I was afraid, exactly, but because Bo wouldn't come to the bedroom after dark, and sleeping without him felt wrong. He'd been on that bed every night for 4 years. The absence of his weight and warmth made the bedroom feel emptier than it had any right to feel. So I'd bring my pillow and my blanket to the living room and sleep on the couch with Bo on the floor beside me. And in the dark, I'd find myself looking down the hallway, at the dim shapes of the walls and the doors, and the darkness that gathered at the far end, like water pooling in a low place. 2 nights ago, I understood. It was around midnight. I'd woken up on the couch and needed to use the bathroom, which meant walking down the hallway. Bo was asleep on his bed in the corner of the living room, or I thought he was. I got up and walked to the threshold and stepped onto the hardwood and started down the hall. The coldness hit me at the ankles, not a draft, not the normal temperature differential between a carpeted room and a hardwood hallway. This was something else. A concentrated cold that started at floor level and rose, climbing my legs the way water rises in a filling tub, reaching my knees, then my thighs, a creeping chill that had direction and purpose, moving upward along my body with a deliberateness that didn't belong to air currents or thermal dynamics. I stopped walking. The cold continued to rise. It reached my waist, my chest. It had a density to it, a presence, like standing in a current that you can't see. Something flowing around me and past me and through me with the patient inevitability of a tide. I looked back toward the living room. Bo was awake. He was sitting at the threshold, upright, ears forward, eyes locked on the hallway, but not on me. His gaze was fixed on a point in the hallway between us, maybe 5 feet from where I stood, at roughly waist height. His eyes were tracking something, moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, from left to right and then back, following a movement that I couldn't see, the way a dog's eyes follow a person crossing a room. His ears were forward, swiveling slightly, the way they do when he's listening to a sound that's just at the edge of his range, and his body was rigid, every muscle locked. That same controlled tension I'd felt under my hand 3 weeks earlier, the posture of an animal that has assessed something and determined that the only safe response is absolute stillness. Whatever Bo was tracking was between us, in the hallway, moving. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. The cold that had been rising along my body shifted, concentrated, moved from a general presence to a specific location, a point source of chill that drifted slowly down the hallway toward me. I felt it the way you feel someone standing close behind you in a dark room, not through any single sense, but through all of them at once. The collective alarm of a nervous system detecting a proximity that the eyes can't confirm. Bo's gaze shifted. Whatever he was tracking had moved. His eyes swept slowly from the middle of the hallway toward the far end, toward me, and the cold came with it, moving down the hall in my direction with the unhurried pace of something that had no reason to rush. I took a step backward. The cold advanced. I took another step. Bo's eyes were now fixed on a point directly in front of me, inches away, and the chill was so intense that my breath would have been visible if there had been enough light to see it. I walked backward out of the hallway. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the dark space in front of me, and I moved in reverse until my feet hit the carpet of the living room and I stepped over the threshold and stood next to Bo. He didn't move. His eyes were still fixed on the hallway, tracking the cold, watching it settle back into the darkness at the far end. And then, very slowly, his gaze relaxed. His ears lowered, his body softened. Whatever it was had stopped advancing. It had reached the threshold and stopped. The same line that Bo wouldn't cross, the same boundary that separated the living room from the hallway, the carpet from the hardwood. Bo looked up at me, and in that look was everything he'd been trying to tell me for 3 weeks. The warning, the sorrow, the plea to not go down there after dark. He'd known. From the first evening, he'd known what was in that hallway. He'd been able to see it, or smell it, or sense it through whatever channel dogs have access to that we've lost or never had. And he'd done the only thing he could do. He'd refused to cross the line. He'd planted himself at the boundary and held it every night, sitting there in the dark, keeping watch, making sure that whatever lived in the hallway after sundown stayed in the hallway. I sleep on the couch now, every night. Bo sleeps beside me on the floor, and we don't go down the hallway after dark. I use the bathroom before sunset. I get whatever I need from the bedrooms while there's still light. And when night comes and the house settles and the hallway fills with whatever fills it, I stay in the living room with my dog, and I trust his judgment more than I trust my own senses, because he can see what I can't. And whatever he sees, whatever it is that moves slowly through the dark hallway of my house each night, he's decided that the bravest thing he can do is sit at the edge of it and not look away. So that's what we do. We sit together in the living room, and we don't cross the line, and we wait for morning. I bought the house in Fayette County in the fall of 2023 because it was cheap and I was tired. Tired of renting, tired of landlords, tired of living in spaces that belonged to someone else and carried the invisible weight of their decisions in every crooked shelf and half-repaired fixture. I'd been working as a paramedic in the New River Gorge area for 6 years, pulling shifts that left me hollowed out in ways I didn't have the energy to examine, and the one thing I wanted more than anything was a place that was mine. Somewhere I could close the door and sit in silence and not owe anyone an explanation for how I spent the hours between shifts. The house was on a secondary road between Fayetteville and Lookout, set on a half-acre lot that backed up to a wooded hillside. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, built sometime in the late 20s or early 30s based on the construction, with plaster walls and hardwood floors and the solid, overbuilt feel of a house that was made to last by people who didn't have the option of doing it twice. It had been on the market for almost a year, which in that area usually means there's something wrong with it that the listing doesn't mention. But the inspection came back clean. Foundation was sound. Roof was recent. Plumbing and electrical had been updated within the last decade. The only issues were cosmetic, peeling paint, dated fixtures, and wallpaper in almost every room that had been applied in layers over the decades until some of the walls were practically upholstered. I moved in and started stripping wallpaper immediately. It was the kind of work I needed. Physical and repetitive and mindless. The perfect occupation for a brain that spent its professional hours making life and death decisions and needed its off hours to be as thoughtless as possible. I started with the downstairs rooms, steaming and scraping and pulling, revealing layers of pattern and color that told the decorative history of the house in reverse. Floral over plaid over stripe, over a base coat of paint that was probably original. Each room took 2 or 3 days. I filled trash bags with damp strips of paper and paste and carried them to the curb and went back for more. I got to the back bedroom on the 2nd floor about 3 weeks in. It was the smallest of the 3 bedrooms, maybe 10 by 12, with one window facing the hillside and a closet with a door that didn't quite latch. The wallpaper in this room was different from the others. It was a single layer, applied directly over the plaster without the underlying strata of previous patterns that I'd found elsewhere in the house. Just one layer, a faded green floral on a cream background, probably from the 70s or 80s based on the style. It came off easily, the paste having dried to a brittle film that released with minimal steaming. I was about halfway through the wall opposite the window when I found the writing. It appeared as the wallpaper peeled away, pencil on plaster, gray graphite on a surface that had been protected from light and air for decades. At first I thought it was a single notation, maybe a contractor's mark or a measurement left by whoever had hung the paper. But as I pulled more wallpaper away, more writing appeared, and more, and more. I stopped stripping and started peeling carefully, pulling the paper back in large sections to expose the plaster beneath. The writing covered the entire wall. From baseboard to ceiling, from the left corner to the right corner, the plaster was filled with handwriting. Rows and rows of it, organized in rough columns, each entry following the same format. A first name, a last name, a date. Written in pencil, some entries sharp and dark, others faded to near invisibility. The graphite reduced to a ghost impression on the plaster that you could only read by angling your flashlight across the surface. The handwriting varied. Some entries were neat and deliberate, written in the careful, upright penmanship of someone who took their time. Others were looser, more casual, with the relaxed slant of someone comfortable with the task. And some, scattered among the others, were barely legible, scrawled in tight, trembling letters that suggested either haste or distress. But every entry, regardless of the handwriting style, followed the same format. Name and date, name and date, name and date. I counted them. 87 entries. The earliest was dated 1934. The most recent was dated 2019. 85 years of names and dates, written on the wall of a back bedroom in a house that had, according to the county records I'd reviewed before purchase, changed hands only twice since it was built. The original owners, a family named Combs, had held the property from the early 30s until 1987, when it was sold to a man named Dale Messer. Messer owned it until his death in 2022, after which the estate sold it to the bank that eventually sold it to me. At first I thought it was a guest log, a family tradition, maybe, where visitors wrote their names and the date of their visit on the wall of the guest bedroom, a charmingly eccentric record that had been maintained across generations and then covered with wallpaper by an owner who didn't share the sentiment. It was a comforting explanation, and I held on to it for about 2 hours. Then I started researching the names. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I typed them in, one by one, starting with the most recent entries where the handwriting was clearest. The first name I searched was a woman from 2019. I found her immediately. A news article from a Beckley newspaper. Missing person. Reported by her family. Last seen at a gas station in Raleigh County. Never found. Case open. No suspects. I searched the next name. A man from 2016. Missing person. Reported in Mercer County. Last seen leaving a bar in Princeton. Never found. The next. A woman from 2012, missing, Nicholas County. Last seen by a coworker leaving the parking lot after a night shift. Never found. The next, a man from 2008, missing, Fayette County. Last seen by a neighbor walking on a rural road near Gauley Bridge. Never found. I searched every name I could read clearly. 23 names over the course of 2 evenings. Every single one was a missing person. Not dead, not relocated, not incarcerated. Missing. Reported to law enforcement by family or friends or employers, and never found, never seen again. No body recovered, no evidence of foul play established, just gone. Vanished from the counties of southern West Virginia over a span of decades, their disappearances separated by months or years, spread across enough jurisdictions that no obvious pattern would emerge unless someone was looking at all of them at once. Unless someone had, for instance, written all their names on a wall. The earlier entries were harder to research. Records from the 30s and 40s and 50s weren't digitized, and the handwriting in many cases had faded to the point where I couldn't be certain of the spelling. But the entries I could verify from the 60s onward all fit the same pattern. Missing persons, from counties all across the southern part of the state, all of them on the wall of the back bedroom in this house. I called the Fayette County Sheriff's Office on a Monday morning, explained what I'd found. A deputy came out that afternoon, a young man who looked at the wall with an expression that cycled through curiosity, confusion, and discomfort in the span of about 5 minutes. He took photographs with his phone. He wrote down some of the names in a notebook. He asked me when I'd found it and whether I'd altered the wall in any way, and whether anyone else had access to the house. He said he'd file a report and that someone would follow up. He was polite and professional, and I could tell by the way he kept glancing at the wall and then looking away that he didn't know what to do with what he was seeing. 87 names, 85 years. A wall-size record of the missing, maintained by the occupants of a house that sat quietly on a secondary road in the mountains and drew no attention and raised no suspicion for nearly a century. That was 4 months ago. Nobody has followed up. I called the sheriff's office twice. The first time I was told the report was being reviewed. The second time I was told they'd get back to me. Nobody has gotten back to me. The wall is still there. The names are still there. I finished stripping the wallpaper and left the plaster exposed because covering it felt wrong, like concealing evidence, though evidence of what I still don't fully understand. Last week I was cleaning the adjacent room, the larger bedroom that shared a wall with the back bedroom. This room still had its wallpaper intact, 3 layers deep, and I'd been putting off dealing with it because the work in the smaller room had left me with a reluctance to discover what might be underneath. But a water stain on the ceiling had caused the top layer to bubble and peel near the corner, and I needed to strip the damaged section to assess whether the plaster beneath was compromised. I pulled back the wallpaper, and there, on the plaster, in pencil, was another entry. Not 87 entries. 1. A single name and date written in handwriting that was sharp and fresh, the graphite dark and unweathered, as if it had been written days ago rather than years. The pencil lines hadn't faded at all. The plaster around them was clean, unstained, untouched by the aging that affected the entries in the other room. The name was Dale Messer, the previous owner of the house, the man who had bought it in 1987 and lived in it until his death in 2022, the man whose estate had sold it to the bank that sold it to me. His name was on the wall, and the date next to it was not 2022, the year he died. It was not any date in the past. The date next to Dale Messer's name was yesterday, the day before I found it, written in pencil on the plaster of a room that had been wallpapered for decades, behind paper that showed no sign of having been removed and reapplied, in handwriting that could not have been placed there without stripping the wall first. I stood in that room and I looked at the name and the date, and I thought about Dale Messer, who had lived in this house for 35 years, who had maintained the list in the back bedroom, adding names and dates over the course of 3.5 decades, continuing a practice started by the Combs family in 1934, who had covered the wall with wallpaper at some point, perhaps when he sensed his time was ending, perhaps as a final act of concealment, and who was now, apparently, being added to the list himself. Not by me, not by any living person I was aware of, by the house. by whatever mechanism had driven the Combs and Messer to write those names for 85 years, whatever compelled the record, whatever demanded that the missing be cataloged, accounted for, written down in pencil on plaster in a back bedroom that nobody ever looked at. I haven't stripped any more wallpaper. There are rooms in this house I haven't touched, and I'm not going to, because I've started to understand something about the list that I didn't understand at first. It's not a record of what happened somewhere else. It's not a log of news stories or police reports, names collected from newspapers and written on a wall as some kind of obsessive archive. The handwriting varies because different people wrote the entries. The Combs family, Dale Messer, others maybe, whose connection to the house I don't know, but the names aren't research. They're testimony. They're the names of people who came to this house and didn't leave, written by the people who lived here and knew what happened and couldn't stop it and couldn't talk about it and could only do this one small thing, this private, hidden act of acknowledgement, writing the names of the missing on the walls of a room nobody would see, behind wallpaper nobody would strip, in a house that sat quiet and ordinary on a road where nobody looked twice. And now Dale Messer's name is on the wall, dated yesterday, which means the list isn't finished. It means whatever has been happening in this house for 90 years is still happening, and I'm living in it. And somewhere in these walls, behind paper I haven't pulled, there may already be another entry, a name I'll recognize, a date I haven't reached yet, written in pencil on plaster, in handwriting that isn't mine, and I'll find it the same way I found all the others. Too late, after it's already been written, after whatever the name represents has already been decided. And the only question that keeps me awake at night, lying in a house full of names that nobody else will read, is whether the next entry on the wall will be someone who comes to this house, or someone who's already here,